Good morning, everybody, and a warm welcome to this webinar on Baltic Sea issues. I would like to wish you welcome on behalf of both the Consulate of Sweden in St. Petersburg and Stockholm University Baltic Sea Center. It's very nice to have you all here, and today we will talk more about waterbirds in the Baltic Sea, threats and measures. My name is Gun Rudqvist, and I work as Head of Policy at the Stockholm University Baltic Sea Center. The center is, of course, a research unit, but we also have a mission to increase the dialogue between different parts of the Baltic Sea region, and especially research and the rest of the society, decision makers, policy makers, businesses, etc. So these webinars in collaboration with the consulate is one way of doing this. And we are very happy to do this, especially together with our Russian research partners. Well, today we're going to talk about waterbirds. We will have two presentations and then time for questions. So please, you can post your questions in different manners. As you all are aware of, this webinar is simultaneously interpreted in Russian and English. And if you would like to listen in Russian, you have gotten a Zoom link and you are with us via Zoom. But if you can just listen in English, you can also join us through the YouTube channel. And you can post questions in both these channels, either directly here in Zoom on the chat, but also at the YouTube, there is a situation where you can put your questions. And we will try to collect them and go through them during the webinar. And we will close the webinar at 9:45. So let's move on to today's topic. For most of us, waterbirds are sort of, an essential part of our sea experience. It could be the long-tailed duck, it could be the common eider, or many others. But many waterbird populations are decreasing. What are the threats and why is this happening? And is there something we can do about it? What is the situation for the waterbirds? So we were going to learn more about this during these 45 minutes. And we have two interesting and excellent speakers with us. It's first Professor Larsson, Kjell Larsson, and he will talk at the subject long-tailed ducks in the Baltic Sea, the need to reduce anthropogenic threats and maintain connectivity between wintering sites. And Professor Larsson is Professor Emeritus of the Maritime Science and Environment at Linnaeus University in Växjö, Kalmar in Sweden. And then there will be Dr. Sergei Kuozov, who will share research on waterbird communities in the Gulf of Finland. And Dr. Kuozov is a senior researcher at the Department of Applied Ecology at St. Petersburg University. Unfortunately, there is a heavy snow situation in St. Petersburg, so Dr. Kuozov will have to be sort of at his home and not being able to come to the camera. So we will hear him and see his presentation, but unfortunately not see himself. But we're very happy to have you here, both Dr. Larsson and Dr. Kuozov. So please, let's move on, and I will give the floor to you, Kjell Larsson, please. Sorry, Kjell, you're still muted.
Yes, now.
Great. Now we hear you. Thank you.
And I hope you can see the picture
excellent,
in full screen also.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, my name is Kjell Larsson. I'm working at the Linnaeus University. And my talk today will be about long-tailed ducks. In Swedish, it's called alfågel. And I will speak about the problem how to reduce anthropogenic threats and maintain connectivity between wintering sites. So the long-tailed duck breed in the Arctic at small tundra lakes in very low densities. They are spread out more or less one pair each lake, more or less to say. And then in winter, they gather in marine habitats. So this beautiful bird is dependent on resources in two very different habitats. The long-tailed duck has a circumpolar distribution. So it breeds on these yellow areas you see on the map. So we have populations in northern Russia, we have on Iceland, Greenland, and North America, and also in Scandinavia. And the population that is largest is what we call the West Siberian, North European population. And it consists of about 1.5 million birds in 2009. And the birds belonging to this population are breeding within this area enclosed by the red circle. And those birds, they are migrating to the Baltic Sea in winter. Birds breeding more eastward in northern Russia, they go and winter in the Pacific to the east. Long-tailed ducks, they return to the same wintering sites in the Baltic Sea year after year. And on the map to the left, you see migrating routes of birds that have been marked in Denmark some years ago. And they are migrating in May up to the breeding sites in northern Russia. And they spend the summer there, they breed there, they molt there, and then they go back to the Baltic Sea in October. And on the map to the right, you see where do they actually stay in winter within the Baltic Sea. And the red areas, that's the most important wintering areas where most of the birds actually stay during winter. So birds from this vast area in northern Russia, they concentrate on quite small areas within the Baltic Sea, and that makes them very vulnerable. In April and beginning of May, the birds in the Baltic Sea, they gather in more northern Baltic proper, in the Åland archipelago, Gulf of Finland, and Riga Bay, before they leave the Baltic Sea altogether in the mid-May. Long-tailed ducks, they are very much dependent on a healthy Baltic Sea. In winter, they eat mussels. They mainly eat blue mussels, size between 5 and 15 millimeter. And they dive to catch these mussels, and normal diving depth is about 5 to 25 meters. More normal is 15 to 20 meters. Usually they dive to collect mussels. And the mussels, in turn, they are dependent on the phytoplankton. So in years when we have good blooms, spring blooms of high quality plankton, which is good food for the mussels become nutritious and fat. And then the long-tailed ducks, they take advantage of the mussels, and they can increase the fat content and the nutrients before they go up north and breed. The long-tailed duck population has declined rapidly. The species is therefore globally vulnerable, classified by IUCN as vulnerable. And this population we are talking about today, the West Siberian Northern European population, is classified as endangered on the HELCOM red list because of the rapid decline. It's still a lot of birds out there, but the decline is very worrying. So in 92, 93, it was estimated to consist of about 4.3 million birds. In 2009, about 1.5 million, and now the guess could be less than 1 million. We don't really know, but we know it has declined since 2009. Oops. So why then is there a decline? Is it so that long-tailed ducks have a too low reproductive success and there is some problem in the Arctic, or do they have a too high adult mortality? Do we see some problem in the Baltic, which cause high mortality? So what do we know today? So one way to study production of juveniles is to take photos of flocks in winter at sea from ships and boats. And that's what I've done for some years now. And then on these photos, it's possible to separate different categories of birds. So in this picture, you see these birds with these red dots. They are adult males. The blue ones, they are females. And the green ones, there are actually two birds which have a green dot on them. They are juvenile males. They are born the previous summer. And by doing this, taking a lot of photos and then compiling them and count the number of birds in different categories, it's possible to measure the reproductive success in different years. And then if we look at how it looks like, we can see that this green line, that's the proportion juvenile that is needed to support a stable population. About 25% of the population should consist of juveniles to have a stable population. But if we measure these, for example, at coastal areas around Gotland, that's the orange bars. You see that most of these bars are below this green line. The average level is this orange line. And we see that clearly below the green line. And also if we measure the same thing at these offshore banks, where most of the birds actually winter, we see that the level is even lower. So on average, from 2009 to now, the juvenile proportion in the population has been too low each winter to support a stable population. So this means that we have a decrease in population. What about threats in the Baltic Sea that affect the mortality of the birds? We still have discharges of oil and chemicals from ships. And one worrying thing is that discharges of non-mineral oils, such as tall oil and other vegetable oils, which are used as biofuels, these type of discharges are actually increasing in the Baltic Sea. The discharges of mineral oils is decreasing, but this other type of discharges. And here we see a ship actually cleaning its tanks with some carrying some tall oil or other vegetable oils. And for birds, these type of oils are as dangerous as mineral oil. And not only that these type of discharges occur, they also occur in the most sensitive areas. To the right, you see the figure I showed before, the red areas where most birds are. And on the left figure, you see the same red areas. And the green line around the red areas is Natura 2000 sites. And the gray areas, that's the main shipping routes. And the dots, the black dots, that's registered oil discharges by HELCOM. This is somewhat old data, but we still have discharges in this pattern. Also in this year, we had one large oil spill covering 25 square kilometers just at the southern Meacher Bank, the southernmost red dot. Other threats in the Baltic Sea, that's bycatches of long-tailed ducks in fishery. And this problem, so it's mainly when you fish, for example, cod by gill nets, or you fish it in the southern Baltic Sea, other species. Long-tailed ducks get caught and they drown in the nets. Because of the lack of cod in Swedish water, this problem has decreased in Swedish water, but it's still a problem in the southern Baltic Sea. So several thousand long-tailed ducks are drowning each year in the Baltic Sea because of bycatch in gillnets. Upcoming threats, which are not been very important up to now, but might be in the future, it is that very large and very many wind farms are planned in the Baltic Sea at the moment. Very large areas are planned. And we know that long-tailed ducks and some other species, they avoid wind farms. So it's not really a problem by collisions, but they avoid wind farms. And therefore, if the wind farms are erected on very important sites, the long-tailed ducks may lose access to important feeding sites. So when it comes to long-tailed ducks and wind power, it's the avoidance and barrier effects that is the most important to consider. So conclusions. What kind of measures can we start to do to reduce threats to long-tailed ducks and other waterbirds? And I think one very important thing is that we have to decide about more strict regulation regarding discharges of chemicals and tank wash water from chemical tankers. A ban should be urgently agreed in HELCOM and IMO. And discharges of chemicals from the ship's cargo space should at least not be legal in marine protected areas, as it is today. Today, discharges of many hazardous chemicals and non-mineral oils are more weakly regulated than discharges of mineral oil. Bycatches, that problem, I think that could be reduced by specific agreements, local agreements, and rule about using gill nets during specific months and at certain depth. I think that's a problem that could be solved on a local scale. And then when we come to the wind farms, we need to assess more about the cumulative effects of the many planned and very large wind farms in the Baltic Sea. They must be evaluated more thoroughly by authorities and governments. Today, the entrepreneurs are very reluctant to investigate cumulative effects of different wind parks. And then, of course, we need also to consider the situation in the Arctic. Factors which might negatively affect the Arctic breeding sites should, of course, also be invested more in future. So, by that, I end, and I thank you for listening.
Thank you, Charles, so much. Very interesting, such a clear presentation. It raises, as you said, many, many interesting issues to discuss and talk about further. Let me just start the questioning by asking, so is it clear, do I understand this correctly, to say that you could actually see the long-tailed duck as an indicator for different problems?
Absolutely. And we see they are declining, and we know some real problems in the Baltic Sea, but we have less knowledge about what is happening up in the Arctic. And they are, of course, more difficult to study there. You can study them on a local scale, but because they are breeding in low densities over very vast areas, it's not very easy to study long-tailed ducks on a large-scale basis, on a population basis. And that you can do in the Baltic Sea. So we have probably in the Arctic because of the low reproductive success. And that's probably connected to climate change, predation pressures, etc. changing. But what we can do is to reduce the threats in the Baltic Sea. And we know we have some threats which could and should be reduced.
One thing you mentioned was the fact that they feed on mussels, and we know that eutrophication rates, etc., is also influencing the situation for the mussels. What about eutrophication in general? Could you mention something about that? Would that be also something linked to the long-tailed duck?
Yes, I think in many different ways. One way it could be that, okay, in 30, 40 years ago, we had more eutrophication, and the biomass of mussel beds might have increased because of that, and might have be a positive effect for eiders, etc. And now we have less eutrophication, or we have less input to the Baltic Sea, and some researchers have coupled that to the decline of eiders and long-tailed ducks, saying, okay, now we are returning to a more normal state. But one should also be aware of that the actual nitrogen and phosphorus levels in the Baltic Sea at the bottom where the mussels are has not decreased as much as the input from land. So we can't really say that the 90% reduction in eider populations in last 20 years and the decline in long-tailed ducks is an effect of less eutrophication. I think that's not possible, really.
Thank you, Kjell, for now. We will get back to you again when we talk together. I will just once again to all our listeners, please post questions. You have your chance either directly here in the Zoom chat or at YouTube. And now I will give the floor to Dr. Sergei Kuozov, Senior Researcher at the Department of Applied Ecology, St. Petersburg, who will talk to us about the waterbird communities in the Gulf of Finland. Please.
Чель, меня слышно?
Can you hear me? I'm Sergei Kozov. Right.
Здравствуйте, меня зовут...
No, I'm Sergei Kozov. I'm a senior researcher at the Chair of Applied Ecology of St. Petersburg University. And I wanted to say that the studies of the communities of waterfowl were carried out over the past 30 years by the following organizations in Petersburg: the Biological Institute of St. Petersburg University, where I used to work, the Zoological Institute, and the Faculty of Biology of the St. Petersburg University, where I work at present. And I was thinking of what particular topic to present, and then decided that a more narrow topic would not be that interesting for the audience. So I decided to acquaint you with the general situation, which we have been observing over the past 30 years with ornithocomplexes and communities. And so if there are questions, then, of course, in principle, if we meet later, if we have other webinars, I will be able to speak. Yes, can you hear me well enough? Yes. Right, so the next slide, please. So altogether, during the second part of the 20th century and the first decades of the 21st century, in the eastern part of the Gulf of Finland, there were revealed 67 breeding species of waterfowl. And here you can find their distribution with the sound. Thanks to the islands in the Gulf of Finland, which we began to work on in the 1980s and 90s. So in the eastern part of the Gulf of Finland, you will find most of the species of this group typical of the Baltic Sea, for which it's typical to have the Mediterranean and the northern boreal species mixed. And most of them in this or that way are represented in the eastern part part of the Gulf of Finland. Now, here, briefly, you can see the map with the nature habitats, green. Green, this is the freshwater part of the Gulf of Finland, where you will find mostly the species typical of the freshwater areas, and the upper part of the Luga Bay is also there. The most interesting part is the area of deep waters and islands. The marine birds dominate. There's such colonial types as the gulls, as the herring gulls, for example. And here you can find quite a lot of species. It can be divided into two parts. The southern one with moraine area, where you will find the moraine ranges with sand on top, and the northern ones, deeper water areas. The areas similar to what we can find along the Swedish and the Finnish coasts, deep water and rocks and islands seriously affected by the glaciers. And next, please. Now, over the past 40 years, there has been a serious change in the species composition. So there are 80 new species, and 7 species have stopped nesting. Now, well, in connection with some species, we still have hope that over the past 5 years, there has been no information concerning them. So what are these species? Next slide, please. Now, here you can find chronologically in the 1980s and 70s, there was nesting of eider, Caspian tern, little tern, great scope, and then at the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, mute swan, grey-leg goose, razorbill, and black guillemot. Now, in the 1990s and in the 1990s of the past century, there appeared the great cormorant, sandwich tern, gagani, and barnacle goose. Next. Here you will find the later period appearances in the new century. In the Gulf of Finland, on the islands, there were noticed slow-nephronin grebe, used to nest in different places. The checkered sandpiper from Siberia. In 2019, appeared avocet, and grey heron. That's 2019, great egret, and that's the result of the strong expansion from the south. It reached the great egret reached the Leningrad region. We already have 2 nesting sites, and it's moving further. It's known in the Vologda region, in Pskov region already, and in 2020, quite an interesting find in the sea. There appeared whooper swans. Prior to that, there were attempts of them to stop in the areas where the mute swans nest, but there was no nesting of the whooper swans. So this is for the first time that we can find them in the sea. As far as I know, in the Finnish part of the Gulf of Finland, there is a similar situation. They can also find the first whooper swans there. Now, previously, nesting along the seacoast was not that typical. No, so that's quite interesting. Indeed, it's interesting to know how it's going to work further and how the trophic and biotrophic niches should be distributed between the mute swan and the whooper swan. And here are the species that stopped nesting. Quite a long time ago, the red-throated loon There were noticed just a few birds, but nesting, but for over 20 years we have not been able to see them. Sandwich tern appeared in 1994, but since 1995, no nesting. Since the year 2007, no nesting of the greater scaup, and 20 pintail. There also disappeared data about the nesting of the Baltic dunlin, turnstone, and velvet scoter. In the past, it was the population was not that big, but since 2015, we've had no information about velvet scoter. And I would like to draw your attention not only to the quality change, but to the quantity change as well. So what is the scale? There's the great cormorant. In 1994, there were 2 colonies with several nests, and in one of them there was about 1,000. By 2018, by 2019, the population of the great cormorant is 12.5 thousand pair. Couples, and over the past 2 years there was a certain decline. We do not know, is that a short cycle or a trend, a long-term trend? So the population of great cormorant was growing, even at the time when it was declining in the western parts of the Baltic in Denmark. So you can see the main nesting sites, red the older ones, the older colonies, and green are the colonies that were discovered, were found over the past decade. So practically all the marine time of the Gulf of Finland. And later there appeared the first colonies of the great cormorant in the Onega and Ladoga lakes. And so we have a lot of data concerning this species. And we can say that we disagree with some of the colleagues who express great concern about the great cormorant and its impact on other communities. We can show data indicating that the role of the cormorant is not that easy to define, and it actually has a stabilizing effect on the community of waterfowl. But this is a separate topic indeed. Next, please. Now, among other colonial types, the trends are obvious. The long-term decline of the population, previously dominating species herring gull and lesser black-backed gull. At the middle of the 20th century, the dominating species was lesser black-backed gull, but the population began to decline, and by the 1990s, there were just about 500 couples. It was believed that they were pushed out by the herring gull, but the herring gull population is also declining. The number of the free islands is quite great, but there is no positive trend concerning with lesser black-backed gull. And these species, herring gull and lesser black-backed, 3 times lower in numbers than the cormorant. Another colonial species, the population grows, the razorbill and common guillemot. The razorbill, since 1990s, is being described, and there has been a growth until 2020, up to 350 birds, mostly in the northern and central part of the Gulf. In certain colonies, there were up to 100 nesting birds.
One more minute, and then we're going to
Понял, я сокращаюсь. Понял.
Yeah, yes, I understand. Yes, as for common guillemot, there has been a growth since 2010. As for other species, respectively, the growth of the mute swan, nesting all over the Gulf in colonies sometimes, and grey-leg goose, stable. Another growing species, barnacle goose, up to 70 couples, so not that many, but a stable population. And next, and here you can see the decline in numbers. The tufted duck, two then goose and red-breasted mergans. As some of other ducks, they show the decline in population, and we still do not know how we can explain this. Now, until recently, the number of eiders has been growing. Now, here you can see what happened actually. A serious change of the in the species, the change of the dominant species. There was a herring gull dominating. Now it takes a smaller sector, and almost 2/3 are the cormorants. And here are some conclusions. So we can see that there is a significant increase in deep sea divers, colonial birds, the great cormorant, razor, mill, and common guillemot. And then there is an increase in the number of herbivorous species, mute swan, greylag, and barnacle goose, and gadwall. So all these species prosper, so to speak. And as for the deep sea divers, we can see here the feeding on large bentos, it's eider, that's growing in numbers. And all the ecological niches are quite new for the region and well isolated from the niches of other birds, the number of which has been declining. And we can see that there is a certain growth in the number of species in the north. So we can't see the impact of the climate at all. We can't see that movement from south to north. There are certain correlations there, but they're much more complex than we might think at first glance. As for threats, there are many. What are the main ones? As we see it, it says the uncontrolled growth of recreation load on the islands, which leads to degradation. And then, of course, it's the activity of ports, active ports and the ports under construction. And the deepening of the water during the drainage work, and very often this work is being carried out several times over a certain period of time, and so this worsens the quality of water. Next. So, no. No. So the main problem is to finish the work on the Ingenberlansky Reserve. It's organized, but there is no proper security, and the whole area is not properly secured and protected. I think this is the most important part of work that needs to be done. The university staff are carrying out this work, and the reserve, unfortunately, doesn't have proper security. So the reserve seems to function just on paper rather than in real life. So that was the main part of my presentation. Thank you for your attention, and I'm sorry for running too fast. And I have a couple of slides now to add something to what Chelly has been describing for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Very interesting. Gave us a good overview of the situation, and also then at the end touching on, threats and possibilities. So would you say that it's possible, would you agree, Sergei, with Shell when he says that you can use the situation among birds as an indicator of the environmental situation of the Baltic Sea?
Да, конечно же.
Yes, I agree. Allow me to come up with some specifications, and I will publish some data, and I will send out some of the data, because I was in a hurry when getting ready, and I really need to check the text and the slides to make sure that there is no misprint. Allow me to add a few words to Chile's presentation, discussion-wise and for the future, concerning the black-tailed duck, the long-tailed duck, sorry. May I? So could we open the final slide in my presentation? No. This is the very last one. Yes, no. Let me say right away that lately, during the accounting period, it seems that the long-tailed duck never stopped in the eastern part of the Gulf of Finland, but lately they were appearing there at the end of May, in the second half of May. So we were able to discover that the long-tailed duck appears here in April, and they stop in spring. You can see those green spots in different peninsulas. You can see the southern part, but in the north as well. So obviously, the wintering has moved to the Gulf of Finland. In the autumn, the same is true. In autumn, in November, after the main period of time and up to the end of November, we can see the accumulation of birds, and it seems that they are actually planning to winter, up to 20,000 altogether, mostly Сескар and
яхтой, мы как бы опасаемся льда.
So after November, well, of course, there is always a threat of ice forming, but over this whole period of time, the birds are here, and there is an impression that there appear cold wintering at the edge of the ice, and sometimes there is no ice on the Gulf of Finland, so it's just in the Neva Bay, but the rest of the area is free of ice. So I think that this is something to be considered, how many birds winter there, particularly when the winter is warm enough. And then two things are to be emphasized very briefly about the Arctic. I worked in Yamal for 3 years, and there was a serious problem there. The nesting waterfowls and the reindeer. The herds grow considerably. And so there are so many of them, about 1 million of them altogether, and the birds disappear. Even in the areas, there is gas and oil production, and where herds are not really permitted. Still, there, the population of birds is higher. So we should look at this correlation. This is true for Yamal, and we can see if there is a too large a number of reindeer and how this number has an impact on the population of birds. And in the 1990s,
thank you for pointing out the important connection between the Arctic and the Gulf of Finland, as also Shell was mentioning. Sorry, but I'd just like to make sure we have time for a few questions also, because time is running out. I see that in the chat, we already have one question regarding, and it's presented to both of you. It's a question for a clarification. Would you say that the tool of environmental impact assessment will be helpful in this field? Do you know success stories when preliminary assessments help to prevent eco damage? Shell, would you like to go first? And if there are a few words. Sergey, could I please ask you to stop sharing? Shell, would you say that that would be a good tool?
Yeah, I mean, in Sweden and other countries, environmental impact assessment is a necessary tool, which, for example, those that would like to build, for example, wind parks in the Baltic Sea, they have to perform an environmental impact assessment. So, of course, it's a helpful mechanism, but of course it could be done in a better way. By that I mean that we need to more look at cumulative effects of many different projects. So each entrepreneur is doing environment impact assessment for their project. But if we have 10 different wind parks, then we don't really have a responsibility to look at the cumulative of these 10 parks.
Yeah, so thank you for stressing the cumulative effects. We hear a lot about that, the lack of cumulative effects in most fields, really. Sergey, would you agree? Would this be a tool that's useful? And then just to sort of give you a last question to think about, if you can choose some kind of action tomorrow, an environmental action or a legal action to make a change, what would that be? So you can think about that while I ask Sergey to answer what about the environmental impact assessment.
Right away, I would like to say that the environmental impact in Russia is a very important element of the construction project. But I think the legislation concerning the waterfowl is not good enough. We still have to work on the proper assessment methods. We can see that there are certain negative projects which still develop. The new ports, for example, that appeared in the Gulf of Finland. But thanks to the environmental impact assessment, it became possible lately to stop one of the projects, the grain terminal, the Batarina Bay next to town. And second, it became possible to make sure that the regional government adopts a ban on the construction of the new reclaimed areas. They're dreaming of those reclaimed lands because they earn quite a lot of money with that, and they try to get some subsidies from the state, but the harm is enormous, particularly in the Neva Bay. So the ban is there. And thanks to the NGOs at present, the change.
Finally, as sort of closing of the seminar, wish for one thing.
Извините, не все успел расслышать. Можно еще раз?
Could you repeat the question, please? Because there was something wrong with the sound. I couldn't hear the...
Thinking as a final question to both of you, because time is running up. I'm sorry that we are pushing time a bit. If you have a wish for something that has to change tomorrow to improve the situation for the waterbirds, what would that be? And then I was asking, could that possibly be, stricter and better implemented legislation? I'll start with you, Sergey.
I think there need to be two things. Well, legislation, yes, and more resources. And the core of the problem is the attitude of all people, absolutely all people. We need to understand that we have just one planet for all of us. And in many cases, we should forget financial profits if they are associated with the harm for the environment, because the environment cannot even be compared in value to any sort of technical devices and successes.
Thank you. I think we all agree with this. Kjell.
It's not an easy question. Waterbirds are not a homogeneous group, so there are many different threats acting on different species. So to make a statement of what can gain waterbirds, it's not easy to say. But I will, if I just mention one annoying thing, is that today it's not legal to release mineral oil from ships in the sea. It's not legal to discharge sewage from ships, but it's still legal to discharge different type of chemicals from chemical tankers in the Baltic Sea. And I think that's a scandal in the Baltic Sea that we still allow some discharges of these hazardous substances even in protected areas.
Thank you so much to both Kjell Larsson and to Sergej Guzguzov for participating and giving us this wonderful insight in the situation. This was actually the last webinar as a part of the collaboration between the Consulate of Sweden in St. Petersburg and Stockholm University Baltic Sea Center. But we will here at the Baltic Sea Center continue with our webinars both in English and in Swedish. So please join us in our newsletter, and we look forward to seeing you joining us at different webinars. And if you have any good suggestions for topics you would like to see discussed, get in touch. And with this, I wish you a nice weekend and eventually a Merry Christmas. Thank you and bye-bye.